Final Fantasy VII, the original, a game I only played so I could play Final Fantasy Remake, but might have just sent me down the rabbit hole of playing a whole bunch of Final Fantasy games. Because, spoilers, I really enjoyed things about this game, not everything though. Final Fantasy VII is a PS1 game, and it shows. Thankfully, it's also a game that has been ported to pretty much every console, with me having played it on the Switch, this port having a few helpers that I'll talk more about in the gameplay. But as usual, we will start by talking about the story, which for me was a surprise that I enjoyed it as much as I did, and it was a big pushing force to me actually finishing the game. Following the story of Cloud, a very stoic and a bit of an ass, but it works as he develops with the other characters while also a lot of his past being explained, justifying his unlikable features, which is good given he grows as a character, meaning he isn't an ass forever. Speaking of characters though, Final Fantasy has a lot of them, and they will vary wildly in quality. Some characters get a lot of development and you really get to know them, really investing you in their arcs. This mostly happening to characters who are very important to the story, characters like Tifa and Aerith, and of course Sephiroth. Villains surprisingly get a lot of screen time here, being somewhat unusual in the JRPG genre, as the genre has a tendency of focusing very hard on its protagonists and their friends slash party members, which I'm not saying as a critique of the genre, but more of a praise of Final Fantasy VII that is able to have its cake and eat it too, with its much more focused story path. Speaking of party members though, here they can be sort of a mixed bag. Some are very important to the plot, like I said before, Tifa and Aerith, but all are somewhat important to the plot. Big asterisk here, because I will talk about it a bit later with some optional characters. But all are somewhat important to the plot in a way that their arcs coincide with helping the plot move forward. But of course, their importance is what makes this a mixed bag, as it varies wildly. For example, Barrett is the leader of the Avalanche, which of course plays a big part into this game, even though he can be a bit of a stereotype. He's still a very developed and likable character. But then we also have my least favorite character, Kate Sith, which honestly I hated his twist and his character development sucked. It is for me the worst part of the story. But he is also a very important character to the story nonetheless. But then there's characters like Sid and Yuffie, who might not be the most important characters for the story, but are still very likable characters that have some development, keeping them engaging. And then there is Vincent, who I can only guess is the parody of JRPG protagonists like Cloud. I don't know, it's kinda funny. He barely gets any lines, and characters in this game get a lot of lines. Which, yes, it is impressive for a PS1 game. But also, to be fair, both Vincent and Yuffie, for that matter, are optional party members in this story. Now, speaking about the story in a more broad sense, it's an allegory for global warming and resource exploitation by big companies. In this case, Midgard being that visual representation of the big city that stands above the ground as it sucks the planet's natural resources. Here being the Mako, the planet's live stream, as it's called many times in the game, but also in this game Mako having a very fantasy origin which connects to some of the characters and their past, including very distant past and history of this world, leading to the more grand fantasy aspect of the story with Sephiroth and his world destruction plans, and of course Cloud and the gang sitting between both his threat to the universe and as the small man against the big corporation. And honestly, it works. It's full of detail and mystery that slowly gets unveiled, and while it can deal with very serious topics in a very dreary setting, it also knows to keep it lighthearted, especially with its once again goofy and likable characters, which keeps a nice balance given this is a 30 plus hour game. Which leads us to talk about the gameplay, and personally, this is what has aged the worst in this game. What was once an innovative and step forward for JRPGs is now more like a few steps back. The problem here is that the combat is just dreadfully slow, a decision that in part must have been made deliberately to accommodate Final Fantasy's ATB system or active time battle, a novel idea to make JRPGs a bit more actiony and having you require more attention in general. The idea here being that even though there are turns, they work on a timer, meaning even if you don't choose an action, your enemy's timer will still happen and he will still most likely attack. That also means that actions stack, usually in the order that they are made, but some special attacks may skip the queue. These special attacks work with a special limit bar they have just for them, where it slowly raises throughout combat and also will save in between combats, meaning you can save the special attack for a harder combat, except for one big problem, that is, if you have a special attack ready to use, you can't use regular basic attacks. Why? I don't know. But that means that gameplay wise, if you want to save that special attack, you have to spend mana, which is kinda stupid, especially when you're fighting through weaker enemies. That being said, Final Fantasy VII's combat is also a lot about exploiting weaknesses, like a lot of JRPGs, so it's not the end of the world, but still annoying when around weaker enemies. Speaking of these mana consuming attacks though, this is probably the only redeeming feature of the Final Fantasy VII gameplay, as it has a very high level of customizability with the materia. There are different types of materia, each one color coded, like for example magic materia is green and allows you to do elemental attacks or healing spells and other types of magic along those lines. Then another example, the yellow materia, which adds commands, things like stealing items from enemies or scanning them for weaknesses. And to give just one more example, everyone's favorite, the red materia, with the summons. These being basically very powerful attacks originating from these summoned monsters. These summons have been in the series since Final Fantasy III and are still a big part of the game to this day, even in Final Fantasy XV, and for good reason. They are epic in the literal sense, with a lot of visual flair when used, which is really cool, even with the PS1 graphics. Continuing to speak about the materia though, it can also be leveled up by being used, which while sounds cool, it also can be somewhat of a grind. A thing you can do is also link two materia to varying effects, but you usually would do this to try and boost the power of a magic materia, like for example, being able to target multiple enemies at once. This linking can be done with your armor or weapons, as these carry the slots you can equip your materia on, and some of them will have those linking slots. It's all a big balance act though, as all of these items can and will affect the stats of your character, having you decide if it's worth wearing armor with lower defense and more materia slots, or if it's worth equipping a material that enhances your magic but lowers your attack. Of course, I'm simplifying it quite a bit here to make it easier to understand. Regardless though, as nice as the materials are, they're still somewhat dependent on your party members, since no matter how much magic materia you equip Tifa with, her stats will always rise towards strength as she levels up. That being said, it isn't too much of a big deal, and materia is still the strongest suit of this otherwise more dated gameplay experience. On the other side of the gameplay, the enemies are cool but also can be a very mixed bag. There's just a big variety of them, which might seem like a good thing, but it's actually somewhat distracting. Their themes clash a bit too much for me. Robots and dragons and godlike giants and all of the in-between exist here and all throughout the world, And while that is cool to see, it can also be a bit distracting for their clashing art styles. Specifically, dragon-like monsters really seem like they came out of another Final Fantasy game. But a lot of it is also justified by the story, so I'm not gonna complain too much, especially since variety is often nice. Now, if I can give my recommendation on the gameplay here, the Switch and I believe some other more modern ports have this ability to play at 3 times speed mode, which, while too fast in my opinion to play with the ATB system, something you can do is turn on the wait system. In the settings, turning the game into a more classic turn-based JRPG, having the game wait for your decisions, and with the 3 times speed mode, it feels a lot better since the animations normally would feel rather slow, again for what I think is compensating for the ATB system. That being said, that is not how I played the game, mostly due to doing this review, so I do not know if doing this could cause any sort of unexpected issues I'm not thinking of, but it also shouldn't be a big problem since you can't just turn off the wait system in the menu, and the 3 times speed can just be toggled on and off with the joystick buttons. Speaking of this, 2 more modes can be used with the joysticks, that being the no random encounters mode, which is very self-explanatory. When activated, you will not get randomly attacked, but of course does not apply to the story battles, and a sort of god mode that keeps your special attack bar always full and heals you anytime you take damage, but enemies can still one-shot you. Meaning, I don't think you could turn Final Fantasy VII into basically a walking simulator to experience the story, so to say. But I will say that it does make the game much easier to enjoy in current year, being able to just bypass annoyances, especially with that 3 times speed mode. Now, speaking a bit more about the rest of the gameplay, since Final Fantasy isn't just combat, there is an open world game here in a very literal sense. At a certain point in this game, you will be literally circumnavigate the world, which I personally think it's really cool, even being a PS1 effect. And I wish some JRPGs would do this today, even with limitations. But I guess we'll have to wait for the next Final Fantasy VII remake and how that deals with this, which will be interesting to see. Regardless, speaking of traversal, as the game progresses you will unlock more and more vehicles that also work as sort of like keys to access certain areas, like a chocobo that allows you to outrun the serpent early on in the game, or a submarine that allows you to dive in the ocean. Of course, being an open world here, there will be several villages where you can interact with its occupants and buy items and materia or armor and weapons, much like other JRPGs. The more notable thing here is the activities that might exist here, like a sort of tower defense real-time strategy minigame that I personally was not a big fan of, but it's cool that it's here. But even more notably, there is a whole big area called the Gold Saucer that is full of mini games like chocobo racing or an on-rails shooter in a roller coaster, which felt awful with the Switch thumbsticks, but again, still cool that it's here. I personally did not waste too much time with these besides just trying them out, mostly because I was more engaged with the story, but they're here and they're still worth seeing, if only for the graphics and how they deal with them. Yes, this is a segue to talk about the graphics and sound. Obviously, from a purely technical side, this is a PS1 game and there is no way around that. Character models look incredibly simple, but also because of the pre-rendered backgrounds that come with this game, it still felt very pleasant to look at. The mixture of steampunk and fantasy, and as it changed from really heavy steampunk to really heavy fantasy styles throughout the game's story, and that being very well represented with the beautiful art of these backgrounds, really does help the story while also being, again, nice to look at. fair to say I really enjoyed it. That being said, this is supposed to be a remaster or at least some sort of HD version of the game. And well, the backgrounds still feel a bit too low res, and my only guess for why this is that the original high resolution artwork has just been lost to time, which if true would be very unfortunate and sad, honestly. But also, with modern upscaling techniques, I'm still hopeful that maybe someday we might get some kind of re release with these backgrounds in a way that really makes them justice, because I feel a game that can make a landfill slum look beautiful surely deserves it. Now, moving on to the sound, a lot of it's iconic and memorable to this day, even with people who never played this game, including me up until now. And it's that good. An orchestral soundtrack that really accents the world that it exists in, pushing it over the edge to be one of the most memorable games of its time and of course in the history of games in general. And I know I may not be explaining why it's good very well. Of course, when it comes to soundtracks and music, this is always my weak point. But in my personal opinion, I love it, and my only complaint is how it's sometimes used. Sometimes the game soundtrack will just continue playing even when going into a cutscene, which would make sense, except sometimes the emotion of the cutscene is not the same as the music that was playing before, and it can be a bit jarring in that sense. Regardless, this only happened a few times in a very long game, and so it's not big enough of a deterrent for me to put it down because of it. But now we reach the point of the review where I must score this game, and this is the oldest game I have reviewed, which does raise some questions about how games should be rated as they age through time. But this is my channel and my video, and haha, my rules, my score. And in my opinion, I'm gonna score games on how I feel about them when I play them, because that's what's important to me. Because a review should speak for itself in telling you if you would enjoy this game, even if it is opinionated by me. But the score is all opinionated. There's no facts to it, it is purely my enjoyment of it. So that's my stand on it. And I'm giving Final Fantasy VII a 7 out of 10. It's still a beautiful and engaging game with its visuals and story, but its gameplay is well past its prime, and it's hard for me to ever recommend the vanilla version of this game, which leads me to talk about the recommendations. And it's hard, one, because I like these graphics, and I know not everyone does, and I really like its story despite its often lack of subtlety. And if you can get over that, and if you still enjoy these pre-rendered backgrounds, then yeah, play it. But in that case, I do also strongly recommend getting one of these more modern ports that allow you to use these helps to make the combat a bit less of an annoyance. Regardless of your decision though, I hope this video helped you decide if you wanted to play this 24-year-old game. And regardless of that, please consider subscribing, liking, and commenting, all the things you can do for free here on YouTube. And regardless of that, I hope you're having a good day, and goodbye.